I'm going to let you into a little secret. I usually hate this style of furniture. However, when I saw this listed on Facebook Marketplace, there was just something about it that grabbed me. I think it's the detail on the front here. It's really pretty, and I instantly knew what colour I wanted to paint it. And here's the before shot. There's nothing personal against this style of furniture. It's just not something that I like usually. Way too bulbous in shape for my liking. And also, it's got dreaded felt in the centre drawer. So I whacked some Fairy Liquid and hot water in my sink. Fairy Liquid, for my non-UK followers, is just dish soap. And I'm going to let that soak there in the sink and do its thing. Then I just clean the rest of the piece with Dixie Belle's White Lightning Cleaner and rinsed. So I've just been doing a few other jobs. I'm just going to go back in the kitchen now and see if the soaking in the drawer has worked. So it has worked, it did work, and it has worked for me before. However, as we all know, vintage furniture differs depending on era and materials used. So it just means that because I might have had results on this one, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work every time. But this has always worked for me in the past. As you can see, the felt is just peeling off super easy. And I did end up taking that centre divide out of the drawer just because there's no need for it anymore. I also never leave my pieces to soak for too long because you don't want the wood to swell and affect the drawer. So I was talking to the good people at Dixie Belle Paint last night about my project, and they've asked me to send them a stripping video. Seems like quite an unusual request, but whatever floats your boat. Gonna retrieve my crock just through here. Got it. So actually turns out Dixie Belle meant stripping furniture, not that kind. Moving swiftly on. So my plan is to strip the front of these drawers with a chemical stripper. Some people ask why or when would you use chemical stripper over, say, sanding, for example. People ask a lot what the difference is and when would you do one over the other. There isn't really a set rule. For me personally, I would only use chemical stripper if there was intricate detail, like on this, which would make it very hard to sand. You'd have to get in all the little nooks and crannies with sandpaper, and not for me. The other time I would use chemical stripper is if I know the piece that I want to strip is veneer, because you can quite easily sand through a veneer. Anything else, I will pretty much sand. So that's just my personal preference. That, like I say, there's no right or wrong way. But I want to try and take the varnish off these drawer fronts. Now, I've got a tin of fairly decent paint stripper somewhere, but I can't find it. I've just looked and looked, and I can't find it. So this is the one I'm going to use. I don't actually rate it, so it might not work. We might have to resort to possibly going and getting one. I just don't have time right now to go and get another tin of paint stripper. So I'm going to use this, see what happens, and see if it does the job. A little disclaimer, if I may. I'm not an expert in refinishing furniture. That is just simply not my bag. There are times when it calls for it to be done on a piece such as this, which would be more sympathetic and in keeping or whatever to the piece or the design. So I have picked up a little bit of knowledge over the years, but again, I'm not an expert because I'd rather be putting paint on something. But in this instance, I am going to be using stripper. What I do know is that chemical stripper needs to be applied fairly generously. Apply a nice thick even layer over it, and then I always cover mine with plastic wrap. Some people say don't, some people say do. I've just found I get better results when I do cover it with plastic because it stops it drying out. So I'm going to let those sit over there in the corner and hopefully do its thing. There are a couple of other bits that I'm going to be stripping back as well, just so that the piece is kind of cohesive and all kind of ties together, and it's not just the 3 drawers on the front that I've stripped back. So this is the bit on the back, the plinth on the back, and it's pretty much sanding off because it's a flat surface. So again, I'm just going to use my sander because that's my preference. So that has sanded off quite nicely, and it's got a little bit of detail in the centre. I don't mind a little bit of the darker varnish staying in the kind of recessed areas of the detail, because what it does is kind of add a little bit dimension. It stops everything being so flat when I'm going to put a stain on. However, there is quite a lot here, so I'm just going to add a bit of stripper to this section to see if I can just lift that bit a bit. Again, same application as the drawer fronts, it's just that I'm only doing this on that centre bit where there is detail. The other thing that I want to strip is these handles, because they are also wood, which I think is really cool, and they've got some nice detail on. So I'm going to attempt to remove them if I can and strip them as well. These little awkward things are called domes of silence. It's like a metal cap that fits over usually the back of a screw head, and I just prized them off with a flathead screwdriver, and then I undid the screws which held the handle in place. And then I'm going to skip back to the drawers. So these had sat for quite a while. I don't know exactly how long, but it differs depending on the piece, the finish and the stripper that you're using. But if you're in any doubt, refer to the instructions on your chemical stripper. Now this is a very handy little hack that I have recently found out, thanks to Dixie Belle again. So this is Scrubby Soap. Now it's not something I talk about in my videos or content very much, and I don't know why, because I actually use this every single day without fail to clean my brushes at the end of the day. It's fantastic at cleaning paint out of bristles of brushes, and then obviously if you look after your brushes, that means they're going to last a lot longer. However, it also cleans up that horrible sticky residue once you have used chemical stripper. Now that puts me off immensely. As you noticed, I just got a bit of rag, wiped off as much as I could, and then I'm going in, I've got some warm water in my bucket, and I'm going to lather the soap up. So a scrubby soap is basically a bar of soap with a scrubby infused into it, and this just completely dissolves all of that gunk that's left over when you're using chemical stripper. Absolutely amazing. So I took off as much of the kind of leftover soapy suds as I could, and then I cleaned it with Dixie Belle's White Lightning, just in case there was any soap residue left on the surface, because obviously that could cause issues if you're using paint or stain afterwards. And then obviously every time you use Dixie Belle's White Lightning, you always rinse with clean warm water afterwards. Also, I just want to point out how dark this wood is when it's wet. It goes a completely different colour when it's dry. It goes a lot lighter, but don't be fooled in thinking that that's the colour it would stay if you were to simply top coat it. It is a very nice colour when it's dry, but if you were to just apply a clear varnish or a clear coat, it would turn a dark kind of orangey red, as you saw when it was wet. If you watched my last video, you'll know what I'm talking about. I'll link it top right if you did want to have a look. I scuff sanded the rest of the piece with my electric sander, and then I sanded back the feet as well to bare wood. I didn't want to chemical strip these because they were quite a flat surface, didn't have much detail on them. I'm going to prime using Dixie Belle's Bond Emboss in grey, and that's just because this piece is going to be quite a bad bleeder. I've been painting furniture long enough to know what's going to bleed through badly and what isn't, and I know this piece will be. So I did 2 coats of Bond Emboss and let it dry. Although my camera does not want to focus, you can see how light these drawer fronts have gone. However, again, don't let it fool you. If you were to just top coat them and hope that they'd stay that colour, you'd be wrong. They would in fact go a lot darker. So I'm going to use wood stain to counteract that and stop them from going so dark. I'm using the colour Bleached Cypress, which is a brand new shade of water-based stain from Dixie Belle's Voodoo gel stain line. I used a chip brush to apply the wood stain just because I've got quite a lot of detail on here, and then wipe back with a rag, so I've just got a very sheer layer of the wood stain on the drawer fronts. The paint that I'm going to use for the rest of it, I'm just going to do a one colour finish because it's got a lot of detail on this piece, and I want to kind of just make it nice and simple and just let that detail speak for itself. So I'm going to use Serenity. Again, this is from Dixie Belle Silk all-in-one mineral paint range. This paint is absolutely beautiful. It goes on like butter. I work in small sections, apply the paint and then lay it off, which basically means run your paintbrush using a really light hand over the top of the paint in one direction. This paint also rolls on beautifully, but as you know, if you followed me for a while, I am partial to using a paintbrush. I'm using a synthetic brush, which does get you a very flawless finish. Again, I work in small sections so that the paint doesn't dry before you've had a chance to kind of smooth it out. But the finish is absolutely gorgeous. And then I went back to the drawer front. So as you can see, it's kind of looking a bit one-dimensional. The detail has been lost somewhat, and that's just because there is no variation of colour anymore. Obviously we've taken all the original varnish off and then stained it one colour, so I just want to enhance the detail a little bit and also darken the overall colour a touch, not as much as it was before. So I went in first of all with Dixie Belle's Best Dang Wax in clear and did a really light coat over the top, then straight away went in with Best Dang Wax in brown, and I'm just using this with a French tip brush because it's got a tapered end and it's going to allow me to get in all the detail. So the clear wax that I put on first is going to allow me to wipe back the excess wax, the excess brown wax that I'm putting on now, and just leave all the brown wax in the recessed areas, creating a little bit more dimension than what there was before. As you can see the difference, top has no wax and the bottom has wax. So because I've used Silk all-in-one mineral paint, there's no top coating to do with this. You can see the sheen on here. I did paint that centre drawer interior in a dark blue just because the interior didn't match the rest of the interior because it had the felt in. Here's a few detail shots of all of the gorgeous carving on the drawers and the little dinky feet and the handles. They all came out super well. I gave them all exactly the same treatment with the wax, so they were nice and cohesive. And here's the finished piece. So considering I do usually